What I was saying is I love doing events for Atlantic Live because they always create these wonderful spaces where it feels like I've just invited people into my living room to talk about education reform. So thank you to the Atlantic Live and to all the sponsors for allowing us to have this conversation right now. If you know when you encounter someone who's with the grammar police and you're trying to use the word data, and they sometimes remind you that data is actually plural. I'm wondering if that applies to education reform, because we talk about education reform as if it is one big, giant thing, but in fact, it is many things. That would be true, right? So I want to hear from all of you, and Derrell, I'm going to start with you. If you could talk a little bit about the state of education reform, just quickly. What do you think is going on right now? How do you see this landscape?
So I'm just glad you led with grammar police. I thought we were going to fight over the Oxford comma.
That's later in the day.
All right, good. I just want to set up the expectations. I would just say that right now, maybe the most important thing is not what the education reform movement has been, it's what it could be or should be given like the current political realities. So I think there are no shortage of really smart people who care a lot about kids who are underserved by their neighborhood schools, working on policies about choice and how to get great teachers into the classroom and how to start great schools and how to reward and compensate people. They put a lot of effort into those things, and we've made a lot of progress as a result, but some of them have become sort of deeply unpopular. And I would say you just look at like the opt-out movement as a result of that. So now I think we're at a place where we have to be like, look, you know, we did these things, we did them with the best information that we had at the time, we did them with the best intentions, but the world has changed. What should we do now? And I think that discussion is going to happen in states around like accountability. We used to have a federal framework for this, and we don't anymore. We have like a fractured 50-state view on that, what's best. And around choice, which I would say is kind of the other pillar. Like, how do we create a world where we can have more unexpected success and more pluralism for parents without sort of having the wild, wild west? Those are the conversations we're engaged in.
So very practical, it seems. You're talking about we need a practicality. We no longer have a 50-state framework. And we'll come back to the idea of whether that's a good thing. Because, you know, state by state, maybe they need their own individual prescription when we talk about education.
That is one view.
Andy.
So I think I agree with all of that. I mean, we have to remember that there was this brief window of time where there was this great agreement, at least in what we used to call the education reform community, but it turned out that these reforms, it was plural. I mean, there are people with certain views about standards. Should they happen nationally? Should they happen locally? On tests, are they always good? Should there be more of them? Should there be less? Choice. Do we believe in magnet schools? Do we believe in charter schools? Do we believe in private school choice? Do we believe in accountability coming from parents or from state departments of education? And there was this period of time where a lot of people put some ideology and philosophy to the side, and we came together, and it felt like, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years where everyone was rowing in the same direction. And then some things happened, and we realized that you can be in favor of charters, but not in favor of private school choice. You can be in favor of great standards, but not be in favor of Common Core. And just these natural differences of opinion started separating people. So I think my current view is we had been together for a while, and now we're starting to separate, and I just think it's time to realize that there are going to be new coalitions that develop.
New coalitions, okay.
So,
Tracy?
I have a different perspective. I agree mostly, but I'm a product of the civil rights movement, and so, you know, we come up on the 63rd anniversary of the Brown versus Board case, and one thing I have learned is that nothing's still working. Right now, kids are still not learning inner city, and so we got to get it right. We have so many, when the administration changes, we have changes all the time, and so we haven't gotten it right. I'm inner city school person, and I'm for public education because we are public schools, but we got to figure out how to deal with just teaching and learning, and we haven't done that yet in the city.
The charter school movement is coming up on a pretty big anniversary. Let's put that under the microscope for just a minute. And we now have a Secretary of Education who is a big charter school advocate. She is someone who walked into the spotlight immediately with the change of administration. We actually haven't seen that in quite this way through a few administrative cycles. What does that mean for the charter school movement? And can you talk a little bit about where you're seeing success, but also the charter school movement is, to speak honestly, uneven. And so where you've seen failure and how have we actually been able to learn from those failures and apply that perhaps to the public school system? Tracy.
So I would say earlier, I just heard that, there's 50 states all are different. And so we had to come up with some kind of agreement of how to tackle this task because, Oklahoma, there are different rules, different laws for charter schools, and there are some states, there are no rules, no laws. And so each state is trying to perfect that. But I will say this, most inner cities, if you take the top largest 50 cities in America, if you take the top 50 cities in America, you would find that most inner cities, there's no choice. In the suburbs, people have choice, and so the kids are learning. Inner city, we're trapped in these schools, and so that's why I decided to start a school inner city because the kids had no options to learn, and we're doing very well. But accountability is another issue.
And when you take on this question, will you also talk a little bit about what's going on, for instance, in Massachusetts with the Massachusetts charter cap, and if that is something that we should be paying attention to as we talk about charter schools?
Yeah, so also I would argue that it wasn't a spotlight, it was more like a heat lamp, but that's another conversation too. The Massachusetts thing I think is really interesting because to me that's a political problem that comes out of the philosophy of the first 25 years of charter schooling that specifically like sort of in the Northeast. So we decided that we were going to make schools or try to make schools that closed achievement gaps for people who were in densely populated areas who had very little choice and who had large numbers of underperforming schools. And that produced some really good things. And in particular in Boston, it produced some of the best charter schools in America. What it did not do is produce large voting blocks of people who were ready to defend the policy or the implementation of the policy. The majority of people in America, and to be pointed, the majority of white people in America, specifically suburban white people who vote, have never been to a charter school, don't know what one is, don't have a friend or a family member.
But so often support charter schools nonetheless.
Well, yes, there are lots of supporters, but I think Massachusetts showed there were more people who didn't know it and were willing to vote against it than there were who knew it and were willing to vote for it. And I think that is a question for, again, the next round of charter policy. Maybe that dual language Mandarin immersion charter school in Brookline is a good thing. Not because you agree with it, but because it took some haters off of the bench who were, trying to kill you when we wanted to expand great schools in Massachusetts by 12 a year.
Yeah, one thing I think we have to remember is for 100 years we did public education virtually the same way. There was a system of public education. You had a central office, the district office, and you had PS1, PS2, PS3, kids assigned to very similar schools based on their home address. Chartering came along now 25 years ago and actually upended a whole lot of things that we just assumed always had to be the case. Chartering taught us that you could have nonprofits that run schools, not just the government body.
Really good ones.
Chartering taught us that you could start new schools and replicate and expand schools. Chartering taught us that you could have public school choice within the public school system as opposed to private school choice. And so slowly, gradually, they've been building and building and building. And now over the course of a quarter century, it went from nothing, literally just an idea, to about 3 million kids in more than 40 states. In New Orleans, more than 90% of kids are in charters. In Detroit and Flint, it's more than 50%. In Kansas City, in Washington, D.C., it's approaching 50%. So in a quarter century, we've slowly grown into an entirely new system of public education. Of course, it's going to cause some challenges and heartburn.
So can I just put a finer point on that, to the last part of that question? The lessons that we take when schools stumble in the charter school, in the charter school constellation. Because in schools, we often talk about creating an environment where students are learning in a realm of nurtured risk-taking. But
I like that.
But the idea of failure is something that is antithetical to a classroom, particularly when you are experimenting with the lives of children. And yet, failure is a model that is something that has been embraced, for instance, in the tech sector. If we were here and this was a tech conference instead of an education conference, everyone would be talking about their stories of failure because failure leads to innovation.
Fail faster.
Figuring out exactly how to fail fast. It's hard to apply that to classrooms and to children. So could you talk a little bit about the charter school movement, the experiments, and that last part of the question, how you learn from those schools that have that have swung for the fence, that have tried really bold things, but have not always been able to produce the results? Are there still lessons to take from that and apply largely to the charter school movement and to education on the whole?
Well, I want to be really clear about something. I think you and I agree on this, but it's not like chartering invented struggling schools.
Right.
It's not like struggling schools finally came about in 1990, 91, 92. I mean, there are lots of places that were struggling. Chartering's one of its reasons for being is saying that the old way of doing things, where you have a central office that runs all schools and we're going to tell kids where to go to school based on where they live, that there's something fundamentally wrong. People argued with that. What we're going to say is we're going to create a new set of schools with something called a charter school authorizer, where we're going to allow families to choose their schools, and then a charter school authorizer will decide if that school's not working, we're going to close it down and replace it with something else. So we know that not all we wish all schools were perfect and they were all things to all kids, but chartering says we recognize that's not always going to be the case. Let's create some new mechanisms to start new schools, replicate great schools, and replace schools that are not working. So it's this continuous improvement cycle that chartering brought. It's just a different mindset than the district system.
Let me say this.
And we knew you were going to say something because he took his microphone and he just placed it right here. I have something to say, so let's hear it.
I think one of the reasons why I'm here, I'm from the heartland in America, and I knew that I couldn't teach all the kids in Oklahoma City, but at some point we have to be transformative. And so now what we're doing, from the success that we've created over the last 15 years, we're creating partnerships with Oklahoma City Public Schools. And so we're saying, hey, you know what, there are buildings and facilities out there for us, to move into, but also we can share best practices. We can embed teachers. We can embed curriculum instruction. We can embed our coaching model. And so we're trying to partner now with Oklahoma City Public Schools so all the kids can achieve at a high level. So I think that's one thing that I've seen in the last 25 years is different than when we first started, because it was the adversary role. And now we're actually at discussions with board members, with superintendents, with community members about how do we partner and share best practices.
And, go ahead.
Yeah, I can't put a mic up, so I'm just going to raise my hand. Okay. Two things I think are embedded in this are really important. So one of the important things about choice is choice. Mm-hmm. And I tell people a lot of the time that, like, I'm on the board of a big charter school network. It was like, we have 14,000 regulators who could shut us down tomorrow. And they're all the kids and families who choose this. It's a wholly voluntary enterprise. And so there is leverage there, I think, if imperfect, that is not normally there when you have an underperforming school that people are assigned to based on where they live. That's one thing. The second thing I would say, and I think this is an important conversation about accountability and what the 50 states or one framework look like about accountability, is that parents value different things. So, and sometimes they don't value the things that we value. So I happen to believe in test scores. I think they matter a lot. Like, some people don't matter quite as much too, right? So what do we do to continue to identify, like, schools that actually don't work, while acknowledging the fact that a parent may have a different set of values around what works for their child than we do? I think that's just really complicated, and I think for the last 25 years we had an idea about what we thought was right, and we're going to build schools that did this, and you're going to go to them, they're going to be great. If you don't like them, you don't want them, you don't have to go to them, which is a good premise, but it's clearly insufficient now.
So for those schools that don't work, what do we do in that case?
So and then I'll let the recovering
Because you just sort of slid that in there.
Yeah, the recovering authorizer talk about it.
One of the things we're here to talk about.
So I think what we found is that, like, is closing schools that don't work is hard, no matter who runs them. Period. Right. So your neighborhood school is not doing well, didn't do well for you, your mom, your grandma. That school's still open, right? Because it's politically difficult to do it. It is easier to close an underperforming charter school, and like in New Jersey where I've worked, they close a bunch of them, like a high percentage of them. It takes a lot of political will to do it because schools are political, and I would argue that, like, school closure in the charter sense is not a defect of the model. It is a benefit of the model. It is a feature of the model, because we've said, we're not going to let a school that doesn't work continue to stay open. That said, like, I think it's not as easy as people thought it was. Mm-hmm. A lot of authorizers talk about, like, default closure, where a school just closes. Like, I think if you default close a charter school, there would just be war at this point, because parents would be like, you can't even not involve me in the discussion about whether or not we should stay open, regardless of performance. So it's a complicated thing, but I think in accepting that closure should be on the table at all times, that is a benefit of chartering as a way to sort of manage schools. You wanna?
Andy, I'm wondering if the political moment that we see ourselves in right now, which is very pugilistic, we are a divided America right now on many things, but especially politically. But I'm wondering if there is an opportunity for a cultural bridge and an educational bridge in the sense that people let's take your state, in Maryland, in rural areas and in center city areas like Baltimore, or in semi-rural areas like, say, Prince George's County or Silver Spring. I'm wondering if in places where people are concerned about jobs, are concerned about the loss of jobs, if there is a shared interest that might create the kind of coalitions that Tracy is talking about, as people in rural areas are looking for schools that are better prepare them for jobs of the future as opposed to the jobs that no longer exist.
Well, that's a great hope. That's why many of us do this work, and why many of us believe in that although the Obama administration had the best of intentions over a long period of time, that their view that there were, in my view, they had this position that there were correct answers that could be given to us from Washington, D.C., whether it's on standards or teacher evaluation or whatever else. And it turns out that states have different cultures, states have different beliefs. Even within a state, you have different communities. Like my state has Baltimore, it has Western Maryland, it has Southern Maryland, rural communities. And so these communities require different things, need different things, and you try to get as many folks involved as possible, empower local superintendents and school boards, while at the same time trying to get at this point of equity. How do you statewide make sure you have policies in place that simultaneously somehow devolve power as much as possible so people feel like they own their schools, while at the same time at the state level saying we have to make sure that every boy and girl has access to a great school. And that's where I find the tension comes in most. Who has the power to make final decisions? Is it Uncle Sam? Is it the state leaders who pay a lot of money? Is it local leaders? Or is it moms and dads who should have choices over their schools? And everyone has a stake in this, everyone has a claim, and finding that balance is the toughest part, but it's the essential part.
Do you see a different kind of conversation, for instance, in your state between the various constituencies that you just described, Western Maryland, Southern Maryland, the Washington suburbs, Baltimore, and the rung of schools around Baltimore County?
I see many more similarities. Everybody believes deeply in great schools. It doesn't matter if you're in Baltimore City or Washington County. Everybody wants to feel like they have control of their schools, that someone far away is not dictating to them. Everybody has concerns about poverty and jobs, and they realize that all of these things are related to one another. It's then when you get past that point, when it becomes about history and culture and am I paying for my schools, am I being taxed so they pay for someone else's schools, that's when things start to get a little bit hinky. Hinky.
Scientific word.
That's right.
I collect personal narratives in 6 words, and sometimes they can be very powerful. And one that I always return to again and again is someone sent in 6 words that said, "We asked for equality, we got integration." And those are 2 very different things. And I just heard you mention the word equality. Can you talk about the difference and the tension between those 2 things in the pursuit of educational excellence?
So, test. Can you guys hear me? So I would say, in this country, over the past 200 years, when we have a mind to do something, we do it well. I don't see all the stakeholders in this landscape behind ed reform. For example, in Oklahoma City, we have the state of Oklahoma, we have a large initiative for criminal justice reform. And we're going to pull it off. But we don't have the same stakeholders at the table to actually understand and break down the misconceptions about the question that you just asked. You know, is it a right? Is it equal, or is it equitable? People are not even dealing with those issues right now because all the stakeholders are not involved. And so, I want to get the same stakeholders. For example, the owner of the Thunder, he is a champion in Oklahoma City of criminal justice reform. We need to get him behind ed reform because you can't do one without the other. And so it's just too many misconceptions out there and a lack of understanding of what's really going on. And so I don't think that question will be answered until we get more stakeholders involved.
I'd like to give Derrell a chance to answer this also, and perhaps Andy too.
Yeah, I do. So this to me is the complicated thing about education versus other things, including criminal justice reform, which I think bookend the same. I mean, they have like 99% overlap. Is that you can go to jail and your life is taken away from you, your freedom's taken away from you. A police officer could profile you and take your life away from you right away. An underperforming teacher in your fourth grade classroom could take your life away from you, and you won't know it until 20 or 30 years later, right? And so the length of the duration to realize the problem powers people's conviction and the their acute posture about fixing the problem. So I do think we struggle even before we get to this place where we can get more people at the table talking about these things in a productive way that takes automation and globalism and differences between rural and urban into account, is getting people to understand it. It's actually a crisis. We weren't making that up. Just because kids keep going to school and come home happy at night doesn't mean they're not being denied what they need to actually be fulfilled and free and equal participants in our democracy one day.
That's right.
Andy, I don't mean to dismiss or to downplay at all the notion of the importance of policy and the importance of politics in determining policy, but some of this is determined by narrative. And the political reform movement has been accelerated in part due to a narrative around prison reform, a narrative around the school-to-prison pipeline, a narrative that we see in popular culture, that we hear in our music, and also sort of a baseline fear of what happens to me. An individual would say, if the prison, for some would view it, if the prison-to-school pipeline is successful, some view success in a different way, or if it's not successful, that problem might be coming to me, or they may be taking my sons or the men, or now increasingly the women in my community. Can you just talk a little bit about the importance of narrative in culture, in education reform, and building a successful narrative that creates a sense of urgency around this problem? Because when Tracy talked about the sort of enthusiasm and the level of, I don't want to use the word excitement, but energy around prison reform as opposed to education reform, I saw both of your bodies sort of shift, and it seemed to be in agreement around that we see much more energy around one than the other. Is it possible to change that in part through the narrative, the stories we tell, the people that we try to bring into this circle and into this issue?
Well, one narrative that I think is essential, especially when we're talking about low-income communities, the narrative that I believe in is all of the people who talk about the importance of poverty are exactly right. They're communities where there just aren't jobs, where there is not safety, where there is not transportation, that communities in history and culture have done terrible things to groups of people intergenerationally. Then when you add on to that, we know that we take these families and we assign their boys and girls to schools that we know that are not working. And then we tell them, we know you do not have enough money to choose a private school. We know that you don't have enough money to move elsewhere, but we are going to continue by force of law to assign your child to a school that does not work. Think of how emasculating that is, how much power you are taking away from people when you know they don't have authority, and then the thing they care about most, their kids, you're sending them to schools that they feel just aren't working. So much of this work that I do is based on how do we empower people who have been disempowered for so long, and that is everything from the school-to-prison pipeline, but how do we empower families and communities and nonprofit organizations to be more involved in this? I think ultimately we do not get a lick of a change in any of this until we recognize that we have to change authority. We have to move more authority from people like me in positions of policy power to moms and dads in communities so they can take ownership over their schools.
One more point. So when I brought up criminal justice reform, and especially when you're from a small state, I think the big push is the cost. Small states can't afford that cost. And until we get that message across, what does it cost of not educating a child? That message has not been out there yet. It's not clear when we're talking about the educational right or those issues. But until we figure out what is the cost, what does it cost our community, our state for not educating kids, I think the momentum would move and would shift. But we got to get there first.
So you're talking about not work ethic, but worth ethic.
Yes.
This is worth it to a
Yes.
community to do something like this. We are running out of time, but I'm going to do something unusual. I'm going to ask for 3 questions from the audience very quickly, and then sort of a bonus round, and you can decide which one. Do we have a roving microphone right here?
Good morning. I'm Sammy Whiting Ellis. I'm an educational consultant. Thank you for the quote that you related to. We wanted equality and we got integration, which to me is not what it was supposed to be. And one of the questions I have is, how do you address the fact that the charter choice movement is an experiment on minorities and inner cities in order to get to the pot of federal money that was there? You don't hear of any of this in any so-called middle-class white communities. But our children are experimented on, and people who had a commitment to them, who looked like them, were displaced based on so-called testing that was meant to exclude, close our schools, and take good property to give it to developers. This is the major experiment, this city.
Okay, so we're going to do this. We're going to do slightly unusual. We're going to ask a couple different questions and then allow you. So how do you deal with the fact that charter schools, in your view, are an experiment on children, primarily brown children, in inner city schools? And in your view, the same experiments are not levied or do not take place in geographic areas where the children are majority white. So let's hold that thought. And then a second question right over here. And I'm sorry if I've had my back to the side of the room.
Good morning. My name is Marla Dean, and I'm from Bright Beginnings. That we run early childhood centers for homeless children. I have a similar question. I live in Ward 7 here in D.C., and the Ward 7 education community, Education Council, civic associations have asked for a moratorium on charter schools and said, why are we being inundated with charter schools in Ward 7 when in Ward 3 there are none? And we are saying we want to have a discussion, because the gaps have not closed, about the experimentation that is going on in our community, and when are we really going to seriously talk about a coordinated effort? So there's a lot of conversation about charter schools here and what they've done, but not enough conversation about what they have not done and the promises that they have not met.
Okay.
And so that's the question I have.
So another question about charter schools and geography, and one last question here.
I just have a question for you all. How can we ensure that young people are not being squashed by all this information and all this skill gathering when we're teaching them in the schools?
Good. So we have three questions. I just want you each to quickly take the question of your choice. And Derrell, you look like we're playing a game show almost. Like, oh my goodness, which question do I take? But I'm going to let you choose. And just if you could quickly answer the question of your choice.
Yeah, I would just say that, like charter schools are filled with a lot of black kids, except in places where they're filled with a lot of white kids, like Arizona, Utah, a lot of places in Colorado, because like schools look like the places where they are. That said, what I think is probably the more important question to answer in the first question is, I don't even know what the lever is, but in the authorizing process, I feel like we squashed two things. Pluralism, so we got really good at making one kind of school and not lots of kinds of schools, and I think that's really important. And leadership diversity, which isn't to say that we don't have tons of really great people leading schools. It is to say they tend to be a lot of type A white people, which I'm fully supportive of, and some of whom work for me. So
Some of whom may be in this room.
Some could be in this room. But when you do that, like you're prioritizing like efficiency over community. I mean, you just are, and I think that's the hubris of being in control, and we can do a lot better now.
Thank you.
Let me address the charter school issue. So, and I hear it all the time. Fair question, but my school resides in a community where the entire community feeder pattern of the schools are F. Pre-K through 12th grade, the entire pattern is an F. It's been an F for years. If we were talking about sports, we wouldn't tolerate that. But we're saying, why do you want a charter school in this community? And that's why I want to start by partnering with the Oklahoma City Public Schools, because we have a lot to offer. But just to say that we should stay in the schools that are not working, that's not fair either. And so we should try to figure out, no different than sports. School's not working. Let's figure out why it's not working. If a charter school's there, let's learn from them as well. And we can learn from the district as well. But we cannot accept any more of the failure as an option for our regular public schools.
Andy, you get the last word.
Yeah, I just want to respond briefly to the first two questions, which I think are great ones, and just let me respond with a series of questions, and hopefully it can be a conversation for the future, which is, why is it that when chartering and school choice got their advent 25 years ago, why is it that so many families decided that they wanted to choose these options? Why is it that so many nonprofit groups decided that they wanted to start new schools? Why is it at this point that 50% of moms and dads and grandparents in DC are choosing these other options? Why are there hundreds of thousands of boys and girls on wait lists for these schools? So this is not to say that any of the questions are wrong, but part of this equation has to be when you empower families and communities to make another choice, and millions of them say, yes, let us use these choices, they're sending us a message. And I just want to make sure that we're open to that message that's being delivered to us.
And do you want to just take the gentleman's question about too much data and how that might be affecting students?
I'm not sure that I have an answer for it. I mean, we are, what's the saying, awash in data and information poor. It's something that I struggle with all the time.
Derrell, Bradford, Andy Smarick, and Tracy McDaniel, thank you very, very much. Appreciate it. Thanks to the audience for great questions.